Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a tense and emotional moment between Diep and James, sparked by Phat's warning that James is hiding only 200 meters away and that Mr. Hoan could move first if he senses anything. What should have been a reunion turns into a heartbreaking choice at the doorstep. James is fighting back in silence, collecting evidence to expose his father, while Diep tries to protect him from a storm that may already be watching from the orchard shadows. If you enjoy stories with romance, danger, and painful goodbyes, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. Diep's fingers hovered inches from the old wooden door. 200 meters. That was all the distance between the life she'd tried to rebuild and the man who had become both her safest place and her deepest wound. The late afternoon sun poured through the pomelo leaves, turning the orchard into a quiet golden trap. Somewhere behind her, the bamboo house waited still, obedient, pretending it hadn't heard her heart pounding like a warning drum. Diep swallowed. The air tasted like tea gone cold and decisions made too late. Inside the old house, there was no movement, no footsteps, no cough, just silence that felt deliberate. She forced her hand to lift. Her knuckles touched the door once, twice softly, like she was asking permission to break her own heart. A pause, then the faintest sound, a lock shifting. Diep closed her eyes for a second. Please, don't look at me like you always do, because if he did, she already knew she wouldn't be able to say it. The door opened. James stood there, hair slightly messy, eyes tired in a way that didn't belong to someone his age. His shirt was rumpled, like he'd been sleeping in short, restless pieces. When he saw her, his face changed hope, shock, relief, fear stacking on top of each other so quickly it looked like pain. Diep, he breathed, as if her name was a prayer and an apology at the same time. She didn't step inside. That was the first goodbye. James noticed. His gaze flicked to the orchard behind her, then back to her face. He tried to smile, but it broke before it formed. You shouldn't be here, he whispered. I know, Diep said, voice steady in a way she didn't feel. That's why I came. His throat bobbed. Did Phat tell you? The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Diep's mind flashed backward hours earlier in her bamboo house, the unnatural quiet, the pale stripes of light on the floor, the lukewarm tea she'd stared at like it could give her an answer. Phat's careful knock, his serious eyes, and the question that had cracked something open inside her. Will you choose a future with him? Diep tried to laugh then, tried to sound distant above it, but the truth had slipped out anyway, trembling and honest. She still cared about James more than she wanted to. And Phat had looked at her like he'd already seen the ending she was trying to avoid. I'm not afraid to love him, she'd admitted. I'm afraid of what loving him costs. Then Phat had leaned in, voice low, like a warning wrapped in concern. I know where James is, the old house, 200 meters from you. 200 meters, close enough to feel cruel. And then the name that always turned the air colder. Mr. Hoan. Be careful with his father, Phat had said. He doesn't lose control quietly. If he suspects James is nearby, he'll move first. Diep had felt her stomach drop, like the ground beneath her life had shifted. Phat had left her his number on a slip of paper, like a lifeline. "If anything feels wrong, call me." Now, standing at James's door, Diep felt the orchard watching, listening. James stared at her, searching her face like he could find safety there. "You shouldn't be standing outside," he said again, voice rough. "Come in, please." Diep's fingers curled around her phone in her pocket, tight enough to hurt. She could almost feel the message she'd sent earlier vibrating in her palm all over again. "I know where you are. Don't open the door to anyone." James took one step closer, stopping at the threshold. He didn't touch her. He looked like he wanted to, like it took everything in him not to reach for her. "I did this for you," he whispered. "If I stay out of sight, you're safer." Diep's chest tightened. "And you?" she asked quietly. James didn't answer. That silence was his confession. Diep lifted her eyes to his, forcing herself not to drown in them. The sun sank lower, turning the moment softer, almost romantic, like the world was trying to pretend this was just love. But love, she'd learned, wasn't always a shelter. Sometimes it was a battlefield. Diep inhaled, tasting the last of the afternoon. Then she said, barely above a whisper like a blade wrapped in silk, "James, I need to say goodbye." James didn't move. The word goodbye hung between them like a thin blade. "Goodbye." His voice cracked. What did he do this time? Diep stayed at the edge of the threshold. The late afternoon sun warmed James's face, almost tender like the day was trying to spare them. "It's not only about what he did," she whispered. "It's what our love is becoming." James stepped closer, stopping short of touching her. His eyes looked sleepless, bruised by worry. "My father is the problem," he said, "not us." "And that's why I'm here," Diep replied, fingers tight around her phone in her pocket. "I don't want to be the reason you tear your life apart." James shook his head. "I'm already tearing it apart, alone, so you don't have to." He glanced toward the orchard, then lowered his voice. "I'm collecting evidence, proof. If I can expose him, he can't control me, and he can't reach you." Diep felt pride and fear collide. "And if he finds out?" she asked. James's jaw tightened. "Then I'll be smarter than him." Diep let out a shaky breath. "James, you call it courage. I call it walking into fire." His expression softened, and it hurt more than anger. "Because if I don't, you get burned," he said. Silence stretched, heavy with everything they couldn't say. In the distance, wind brushed the pomelo leaves soft, whispering, like someone moving just out of sight. "I still have feelings for you," Diep admitted. "That's why this hurts." James's throat bobbed. "Then don't do it," he whispered. "Don't leave." Diep forced herself to hold his gaze. "I'm not leaving because I stopped loving you. I'm leaving because I know what this will cost." James's eyes flashed. "Cost what?" "You," Diep said, quiet and honest. "Your peace, your future, the part of you that's still trying to be a good son, even when he doesn't deserve it." "He doesn't deserve anything," James hissed. "Maybe not," Diep replied, voice trembling now. "But he's still your father, and if loving me makes you choose, it will break you from the inside. You'll fight him and start hating yourself too." James stared at her, breathing hard, like he was holding back a shout. I don't have parents, Diep added, softer, so I know how precious even a complicated family is. I can't be the person who pushes you into losing it forever. James looked away, then back, eyes wet. So what am I supposed to do? Let him win? No, Diep said. Fight him, but don't turn me into the battlefield. James took a step closer and caught the edge of her sleeve, the smallest touch, like he was afraid she'd vanish. If you walk away now, he whispered, what happens to us? Diep's chest burned. The answer was sharp and unfair. Two people, she said, two fates, and right now they don't match. James swallowed. Tell me you don't love me, he pleaded. If you can say it, I'll let you go. Diep opened her mouth. Nothing came. James's grip loosened like he understood. A faint crunch sounded from the orchard path gravel shifting under a shoe. Or maybe a small animal. Both of them froze. James's head snapped toward the trees. Diep's heart dropped straight into her stomach. Go inside, she whispered urgently. James didn't move. Did you see someone? No, Diep said, and hated that it wasn't a lie because not seeing was worse. She pulled her sleeve free gently, not as rejection, but as survival. That's the point. If he's watching, he won't announce himself. James's eyes hardened. I'm not afraid of him. You should be afraid of what he'll do, Diep corrected, voice shaking. She lifted her phone, thumb hovering over the contact Phat had given her. Promise me you'll disappear if you feel him closing in. Not brave, alive. James held her gaze for a long second, then nodded once, stiff, angry, helpless. I promise. Diep stepped back before her body betrayed her. James didn't chase her. He just stood in the doorway, holding himself together by sheer will. Diep turned and walked into the lengthening shadows. Behind her, James's voice followed, hoarse and dangerous with hope. If I bring him down, will you come back? Diep didn't look back. If she did, she'd run. She kept walking as the sun slid toward dusk, the orchard darkening like a closing eye. I don't know, she whispered, and the fact that it wasn't no was the last thing she could give him.
Sau khi Phat đến thăm Diệp và hỏi cô muốn tương lai nào với James, anh cảnh báo cô rằng James đang trốn trong một ngôi nhà cũ chỉ cách 200 mét, khuyên cô nên cẩn thận với ông Hoan. Bị cuốn hút bởi tình yêu và nỗi sợ hãi, Diệp đến đó vào cuối buổi chiều và gặp James ở ngưỡng cửa. Từ chối bước vào như một lời tạm biệt lặng lẽ, James cầu xin cô ở lại với tiết lộ rằng anh đang bí mật thu thập bằng chứng để vạch trần cha mình và bảo vệ cô. Diệp thừa nhận cô vẫn yêu anh nhưng nói rằng tình yêu của họ đang trở thành một chiến trường có thể phá hủy James và phá một mối quan hệ cha con mãi mãi. Diệp khuyên James nên ưu tiên sự sống còn giữ liên lạc với Phat. Bước đi vào khu vườn đang dần dần tối, James hỏi liệu cô có trở lại sự thật khi được phơi bày này hay không.